An elderly black woman was humiliated at the bank, but luckily, Big Shaq was there. Some stories begin in the most ordinary places, on a day that seems like any other, only to unfold into something much greater, something that reveals the true nature of power, respect, and justice. That's exactly what happened one late afternoon at First Pacific Bank on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, where the line stretched from the teller's desk to the door. The atmosphere in the bank was tense, with murmurs of frustration mixed with sighs from customers growing impatient. Each tick of the clock seemed to slow as people waited their turn, their fingers quickly scrolling through their phone screens, glancing up occasionally at the wall clock. The bank employees were busy typing away on their keyboards, moving swiftly from one counter to the next, trying to process a multitude of transactions. Amidst the bustling crowd, a 73-year-old woman quietly stepped forward. Linda Carter, a retired teacher, clutched a silver envelope with slightly trembling hands. She wore an old but well-maintained sweater, her kind face showing signs of worry. Linda wasn't the type to complain often. For many years, she had lived frugally, carefully budgeting her modest pension. Every time she went grocery shopping, she made sure to calculate each item, ensuring she didn't overspend. For her, every dollar counted. But today, holding her bank statement, something unusual had happened. Strange fees appeared. Small amounts, but enough to affect her tight budget. The odd thing was, she had never been charged these fees in over 30 years. Taking a deep breath to stay calm, she approached the counter, hoping someone would explain. She just needed a reasonable explanation, a little help. But she had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything would turn into a nightmare. Linda stood in front of the counter, gripping the envelope tightly in her hand, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. In front of her was Brittany Wallace, a young bank employee, probably just over 20, with her hair neatly tied up high, but her eyes clearly showed fatigue mixed with arrogance. She sat back in her chair, typing hurriedly on the keyboard without bothering to look up at the customer in front of her, as if Linda were just one of the hundreds of people she had to deal with during this long workday. Linda took a deep breath and spoke up, her voice still gentle and polite, because for all these years she had always believed that as long as they communicated with respect, any issue could be resolved. "I'm sorry, but my account has been charged with fees I wasn't informed about. Could I check this again?" Brittany continued to stare at the screen, not even bothering to spare a second to look at the older woman standing before her. Her fingers kept tapping on the keyboard mechanically, and in a flat, emotionless tone, she replied carelessly, "That's the standard account maintenance fee. Everyone has to pay it." Linda blinked, sensing that something was wrong. She had used this account for over 30 years, always keeping it in the best possible condition, and never had she been charged such fees. She wasn't there to argue or demand anything unreasonable. She just wanted to understand why this anomaly had occurred with her account. "But I've been using this account for more than 30 years and never had such fees before," she said, trying to remain calm, though a sense of unease began to stir in her chest. It was only then that Brittany finally looked up, but not to listen or show any concern for the customer's issue. She sighed deeply, as if enduring an unnecessary nuisance, then reached out to snatch the envelope from Linda's hand without asking. Her eyes barely skimmed the papers inside, showing no intention of reading or checking anything carefully. After just a few seconds, Brittany closed the envelope and pushed it back toward Linda, her eyes flashing with impatience, bordering on rudeness. "It's in the contract terms. If you didn't read it, that's your problem." The sharp, cutting words felt like a knife to Linda's dignity. Her hands tightened around the envelope, her lips pressed together, a sense of discomfort creeping into her chest. She was not the type to complain or cause trouble, but Brittany's attitude made her feel disrespected. Before she could react, Linda suddenly heard a soft laugh from the waiting area. A group of young people sitting nearby were smirking, and a middle-aged man rolled his eyes and looked away, pretending not to notice what was happening. No one spoke up to defend her. No one showed any sympathy. They all had their own issues and didn't want to waste time or energy on an old woman they didn't know. In that moment, Linda felt her face heat up, not only from the embarrassment but also from the quiet shame creeping into her heart. Her entire life, she had been a teacher, someone who had stood before a classroom, teaching hundreds of students, passing on knowledge and values to many generations. But now, as old age had arrived, she was being treated like someone who didn't understand, an invisible person unworthy of respect. She didn't want to make a scene or become the center of unwanted attention, but she knew she couldn't let this end like this. If she stayed silent today, who knew how many others would find themselves in the same situation tomorrow? Linda stood still at the counter, the envelope in her hand now crumpled by the tight grip of her fingers. The space around her seemed to grow larger, while she became smaller with every passing second. She was not the type of person to cause trouble, but today, when the few meager coins in her account suddenly disappeared under vague fees, she knew she could no longer remain silent. However, before she could say anything more, a figure appeared from behind the counter, walking slowly yet purposefully. Carl Jensen, the branch manager of the bank, approached, a polite but fake smile spreading across his face. He wore a well-tailored gray suit, holding an expensive pen that he unconsciously twirled between his fingers, a habit of those who always believed they controlled everything. Brittany immediately changed her demeanor, straightening her back, her voice suddenly becoming clearer and sharper as she reported succinctly, yet with sarcasm, "Just a customer who doesn't understand the policy, boss." Carl Jensen did not reply immediately. He looked Linda up and down, his cold blue eyes revealing a mixture of arrogance and contempt. To someone like him, an old woman with a meager pension was not worth the time. In the operation of a large bank, small customers, especially those who did not generate profit, were simply insignificant numbers in the monthly report. After a few seconds of thought, Carl nodded slowly, as if he had just made a very important decision, then turned to Linda with a face so polite it seemed fake. "Ma'am, if you do not maintain the minimum balance, you will incur a fee. We can't do anything about it. It's the bank's policy." His tone was monotonous, lacking any sympathy or concern. It was like someone reciting a rule they had spoken 1,000 times, no longer having the patience to explain further. Linda, still trying to maintain her ground, took a deep breath and then spoke gently but firmly. "I have always kept a good account. These fees appeared suddenly without anyone notifying me. I just want to understand why." But instead of listening, Carl Jensen chuckled lightly, a brief laugh full of contempt. He crossed his arms over his chest, tilted his head slightly as if speaking to a child who did not understand how the world worked, then raised his voice louder, enough for all the customers in line behind to hear clearly. "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't for you." The room fell silent. Linda felt a cold chill run down her spine. All eyes in the bank were on her, but no one dared to intervene. The people behind her, also waiting to complain about their own issues, suddenly turned away, pretending to focus on their phones, the clock on the wall, or anything other than the conversation unfolding before them. They knew what Carl Jensen said was wrong. They knew these fees could, and probably had, happened to them. But no one wanted to be noticed. No one wanted to be the next one humiliated publicly like this. Silence was always the easier choice. Linda felt a tightness in her chest. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. She was just an ordinary woman, living frugally on a small pension, not wishing for anything more than a reliable bank to deposit her savings. She had trusted this bank for over 30 years, and now they were telling her she didn't belong here just because she didn't have enough money. Shame overwhelmed her. That feeling came not only from the public humiliation, but also from the utter indifference of those around her. And then, just as Linda was losing hope, a voice cut through the silence that enveloped the entire room. "Man's not hot, but why you actin' so cold to this lady?" A simple question, but the deep, authoritative tone made everyone in the bank turn toward the door. A figure appeared, standing boldly in the doorway of the bank. The atmosphere in the bank froze after Carl Jensen's insult. Linda stood there, a heavy weight on her chest as every gaze avoided hers, with no one speaking up to defend or oppose. She didn't know which was more painful, the cruelty of the bank manager or the indifference of those around her. No one wanted to intervene. No one wanted to put themselves in an awkward situation, and it was this silence that deepened the shame she felt. And then, bam! A voice rang out, cutting through the tense atmosphere, deep and powerful like a direct punch to the indifference filling the room. "Man's not hot, but why you actin' so cold to this lady?" The room fell silent, and everyone in the bank turned their heads toward the door, where a tall figure stood confidently, hands in the pockets of a shiny, puffy black coat, eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. No one needed to ask who this person was. Just by the confident demeanor, the strong stance, and that distinctive voice, most people immediately recognized him. Big Shaq, famous rapper, the one who made the world go wild with his hit "Man's Not Hot," was standing right there, facing Carl Jensen directly. The atmosphere in the bank suddenly changed. What had been uncomfortable and stifling turned into a different kind of energy, a nameless tension as Big Shaq's presence shattered the power wall Carl Jensen had built. Bank employees paused. Brittany Wallace subtly shifted away as if to distance herself from the center of the confrontation. Some customers in line looked up, their curiosity mixed with amusement, while others whispered among themselves, realizing that the man standing before them was no ordinary customer. Carl Jensen furrowed his brow, irritated by the disruption to his control over the situation. He didn't recognize the man immediately, but Big Shaq's attitude, the way he stood boldly in the center of the room, staring directly into his eyes, made him feel uneasy. As a manager with years of experience, Carl was used to holding power, accustomed to saying a word and making customers fall silent, but this time he felt something different. Instead of stepping back, Carl decided to maintain his confident stance, straightened his suit collar, took a step forward and raised an eyebrow, his voice full of challenge. "Who are you to interfere in this?" Big Shaq didn't answer. Immediately, he slowly raised his hand, removed his cap, revealing a face that most people in the room were beginning to recognize. A few whispers spread among the customers, those who knew his fame but hadn't expected to see him in such a situation. A moment of silence passed, and then Big Shaq looked up, his gaze still locked on Carl Jensen like a predator observing its prey, before speaking in his deep, commanding voice, each word clear and decisive. "I'm Big Shaq, and what you're doing is a mad ting." The statement hit like thunder, completely shattering Carl Jensen's arrogance. Some customers chuckled quietly, others whispered to each other, while curious eyes remained fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. Some bank employees, including Brittany, exchanged glances as if trying to guess how this would end. Carl stood still for a moment, his gaze wavering slightly before he quickly regained his confident exterior. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not on his own turf. But what made him uneasy was how Big Shaq stood there, neither angry nor losing control, but completely calm, as if he knew exactly what he was doing and had no intention of backing down. For the first time that day, Carl Jensen felt the pressure weighing on his shoulders. He didn't know that the power game he was so accustomed to controlling was about to be turned upside down in a way he had never experienced before. The atmosphere in the bank became so tense that one could feel every held breath of the people around. The fluorescent lights reflected off the shiny black puffer jacket of Big Shaq as he stepped forward, each slow yet heavy step. All eyes were on him and Carl Jensen, no one daring to move or speak, as if they were all witnessing an intense showdown about to unfold. Carl didn't back down, but his hand instinctively tightened around the pen in his grip as a defensive reflex. He wasn't used to being openly challenged, especially not in front of his customers and employees. Throughout his years in management, he had always controlled situations to his advantage. A smirk, a slight shake of the head, a short sentence was enough to shut down any complaints. But today, facing Big Shaq, he felt something was different. Big Shaq stood firm in front of Carl, directly facing him without blinking, and then gently but clearly shifted his gaze toward Linda. His deep voice was calm but decisive. "Ma'am, what is your issue?" Linda, still trembling from what had just happened, looked up at the towering man in front of her, her aged eyes shining with a faint glimmer of hope. She carefully handed Big Shaq the envelope, her hand still shaking. He received it with care, as if holding something far more significant than just a few bank papers. Big Shaq opened the envelope, flipping through the bank statements carefully. His face gave no expression, but his sharp eyes scanned the numbers, each fee listed intricately, hidden among the tiny fine print. Everything passed by in mere seconds, but it was enough for him to understand what was going on. After reviewing the documents, Big Shaq slowly folded them back, looking up at Carl Jensen, his gaze calm but sharp, as if he could see through the other man's thoughts. His voice dropped lower, each word clear and heavy. "So, you're telling me the system is always right?" Carl swallowed hard, then quickly regained his usual confident demeanor, trying to control the situation with a professional but empty answer. "Of course, we follow policy. These fees are applied according to the bank's clear regulations." Big Shaq didn't seem surprised. Instead, a cold smile briefly appeared on his face, a smile of someone all too familiar with hollow excuses like that. He tilted his head, staring at Carl for a long moment, as if assessing whether the man truly believed his own words, before slowly speaking again, his voice deep but tinged with sharp sarcasm. "Or is this just another mad money-making scheme?" The room fell into silence. Some customers inhaled sharply, and several bank employees exchanged worried glances. Carl Jensen suddenly felt a chill down his spine, even though the air conditioning was running at a moderate temperature. He wasn't used to being exposed like this in front of everyone, especially not by someone who didn't seem intimidated by his power. Brittany Wallace, who had been standing by the counter, subtly shifted behind, her gaze flickering between Carl and Big Shaq. She knew full well that these fees weren't entirely transparent. She knew that over the past 2 months, countless elderly customers had complained, but Carl had coldly dismissed them. She knew this was wrong, but she also knew her job depended on following Carl's orders. Carl blinked several times, trying to find a reasonable answer, but Big Shaq didn't give him the chance to deflect. He slowly crossed his arms, his gaze never leaving Carl, as if waiting for an explanation that could convince the entire room watching the scene unfold. "Because, from what I see here," Big Shaq continued, his voice slow but heavier than ever, "these fees only started appearing 2 months ago, right?" Carl flinched. Big Shaq smirked, pressing on. "So, explain to me, why would a customer who has been loyal to this bank for over 30 years, always keeping their account in good standing, suddenly be charged these new fees without any prior notice? And not just this lady, but many others as well." He scanned the room, letting his question hang in the air, allowing others to wonder if they had unknowingly found themselves in the same situation. Carl clenched his jaw, his hand on the counter tapping lightly, a small habit that appeared whenever he felt he was losing control. He realized the situation was tipping against him, but still tried to keep his voice steady, though it lacked the certainty it had at the beginning. "The system is programmed according to the regulations from above. We are just following policy." Big Shaq nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated this response, then tilted his head, raising an eyebrow, his voice turning dangerously low. "Right. But tell me, Carl, do you actually check if those charges are fair? Or do you just press the ting and move on?" Carl was speechless. A few murmurs arose from the customers in line, their eyes now full of suspicion as they began to realize the oddity of the whole situation. A young woman standing near the counter suddenly spoke up, her voice tinged with frustration. "That's right. My account was charged fees I don't understand." A middle-aged man nearby nodded, adding, "Same here." This can't be a coincidence. The room suddenly became more chaotic. People who had been silent earlier now started talking to each other, exchanging stories about questionable fees they had thought were personal mistakes or standard procedure. But now, with Big Shaq's presence and his sharp questions, they realized something was wrong. Big Shaq stood there, unfazed, simply observing Carl Jensen's reaction, waiting to see what he would do next. At this point, Carl Jensen was no longer just facing Big Shaq. He was facing an entire room full of customers slowly realizing the truth. The atmosphere in the bank was no longer silently tense, but began to shift into an underground storm, a feeling of dissatisfaction and explosion, as if it had been building up for a long time without anyone daring to speak up. Big Shaq, still standing firm like a fortress, slowly scanned the room, his sharp gaze observing each person, their expressions and reactions. He didn't turn to look at Carl Jensen anymore because he knew that at this moment, that man had lost control of the situation. Carl was used to controlling every word, every conversation, but this time he had lost the balance of power. Big Shaq took a deep breath and then spoke, his voice low but resonant, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Who here has been charged strange fees in the last 2 months?" A brief moment of silence passed, but immediately hands began to rise. First, a middle-aged man, wearing a work uniform, seemingly just finishing his shift and stopping by the bank to check his account. His face clearly showed anger as he raised his hand, casting a suspicious look at Carl. Next, a young mother, holding her baby, hesitated for a moment before also raising her hand, her face showing worry as she remembered the times her bank statements had shown deductions she hadn't noticed. In the far waiting area, an elderly couple looked at each other as if trying to confirm their suspicions that they had ignored over the past 2 months, before both slowly raised their hands. Then, like a chain reaction, one by one, people began to check their accounts, whispering to each other, and more hands went up. Some people near the counter opened their phones to check their statements, and after a few seconds of hesitation, they too raised their hands, their faces filled with indignation and dissatisfaction. Big Shaq nodded slightly, as if he had anticipated this for a long time. He calmly turned around, this time not looking at Carl Jensen, but directing his gaze straight at Brittany Wallace, the young bank clerk who had just shown contempt for Linda a few minutes ago. Brittany no longer held her arrogant confidence. Her face began to turn pale, her eyes widening as she realized the whole situation was slipping out of control. She furtively glanced at Carl, as if seeking guidance, but Carl Jensen no longer looked composed. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, his hands tightly clasped together as if trying to suppress his anxiety. This was no longer just a customer complaining. This was a wave of protest, something he could not easily put out with a few dismissive words like before. Big Shaq didn't need to say anything more now. His silence was his most powerful weapon, because he knew that what was unfolding before Carl Jensen was enough to expose the truth. An older man in an old suit, looking like he was retired, stepped forward, his voice carrying the anger he had suppressed for so long. "So, this isn't just a small issue. This is how this bank operates, huh?" Another woman added, her voice trembling with anger. "I thought I had forgotten about those fees, but it turns out I was charged without being notified." At that moment, the phone of a bank employee rang from inside the office. Another employee immediately rushed in, but their eyes looked a little panicked when they saw the screen. Brittany, standing at the counter, glanced over, and immediately the worry on her face became even more apparent. Carl, though sweating, tried to remain as calm as possible, but anyone with eyes could see his teeth clenched, his hand tapping lightly on the counter, a small habit he had whenever he felt cornered. Big Shaq didn't give Carl the chance to avoid the situation. He tilted his head, raised an eyebrow, and spoke in a calm yet clearly sarcastic tone. "So, Carl, are you going to fix this now, or are we going to make this go viral?" The question landed like a direct blow to Carl Jensen. Carl froze. A silence enveloped the bank for a few seconds before whispers began to spread. Some customers put their hands in their pockets to grab their phones. Some had already started recording, while the bank employees behind the counter stood motionless, none daring to speak. Carl took a deep breath but said nothing. He was thinking, trying to find a way out of this situation, but he knew one thing for sure. This time, he couldn't just shrug off the responsibility as easily as before. Carl Jensen stood motionless, his eyes darting between the furious customers and Big Shaq, who maintained a cold, unwavering gaze as if seeing through every trick Carl had been playing all this time. The room was no longer a regular bank. It had transformed into a public courtroom, with Carl standing before a jury of customers who were slowly realizing that they had been deceived for the past 2 months. Big Shaq, wasting no time, took a step forward and pointed at Brittany Wallace, the teller who was still pale, frozen behind the counter. His voice rang out, deep but firm, not a question but a command. "Open the system. Check her account right now." Brittany, too panicked to keep playing the role of the superior she had before, glanced at Carl as if waiting for a signal, but Carl said nothing. He remained still, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the computer screen as if he could reverse the situation with sheer willpower. Now! Just one word, but full of authority, rang out from Big Shaq, causing the room to tremble with its weight. Brittany jumped, quickly typing on the keyboard, her fingers shaking so much that she had to re-enter the information twice before it was correct. All eyes were glued to the screen as Linda Carter's account information appeared. The statement flashed before their eyes, the numbers jumping out from the screen, exposing the truth that Carl Jensen had been trying to hide. Big Shaq squinted, leaning in closer to the screen, and suddenly pointed to a line in the system, his voice loud and strong. "Boom! Look at that! The system changed exactly 2 months ago." The room erupted in a frenzy. Whispers turned into exasperated voices. Customers near the counter leaned forward to see what was displayed on the screen. And indeed, right there, a policy change had been applied 2 months ago, causing a series of accounts to be charged new fees without any notification. Carl Jensen, who had been trying to maintain his calm demeanor, now looked as though he had just been slapped across the face. His eyes widened, his hands instinctively clenched into fists, but he still searched for a way to regain control of the situation. He opened his mouth to say something, but quickly shut it again, as clearly there was no excuse left. Brittany, who had entered the information into the system, instinctively took a step back, as if she no longer wanted anything to do with this mess. Big Shaq nodded, as if confirming something he had known all along. He turned, scanning the increasingly furious customers, then raised an eyebrow and looked at Carl Jensen once more, his voice still deep and calm, but laced with unmistakable danger. "So, Carl, you were saying something about company policy?" Carl took a deep breath, but anyone could see the sweat trickling down his temple. He was standing on a razor's edge between saving his career or losing everything in an instant. But Big Shaq didn't stop there. He crossed his arms, tilted his head slightly, and lowered his voice to a dangerously quiet level. "Tell me, Carl, was this a mistake, or was it intentional?" That question was not just a question. It was a trap from which Carl couldn't escape. If he said it was a mistake, then why hadn't anyone fixed it in the past 2 months? And if he admitted it was intentional, it would mean he had just confessed to blatant fraud right in front of dozens of customers and employees. A true nightmare. Carl swallowed hard, his gaze scanning the room, desperately looking for a foothold, an ally, someone who could help him get out of this mess. But even Brittany, who had been loyal to him before, now stood frozen, unable to look at him. The customers were now fully on Big Shaq's side. They were no longer isolated individuals with separate complaints. They had become a collective, an angry mob, and Carl Jensen knew very well that once a crowd realizes they've been exploited, their power becomes uncontrollable. Big Shaq stared at Carl, never breaking eye contact, as if waiting for an explanation that the whole bank was waiting for. But Carl Jensen couldn't say anything, because for the first time in his career, he no longer had control. Carl Jensen stood still, sweat beginning to soak along the collar of his shirt. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, but not out of anger, rather out of tension. He realized there was no turning back. All the excuses, all the deceptive words he had used to silence clients over the years were useless now, facing the sharp gaze of Big Shaq and the growing fury filling the room. Big Shaq, still standing firmly with his arms crossed, kept his eyes locked on Carl, then slowly pointed a finger at him, his voice low and full of pressure. "You will refund all this money, not just to these folks here, but to everyone affected." The statement wasn't a request, it was an order, a sentence that couldn't be ignored. Carl Jensen opened his mouth, but only stammered out a meaningless sound. His eyes quickly darted over to Brittany Wallace, as if looking for an ally, but Brittany didn't dare look up. She had understood that, even though she had followed Carl's orders before, he had now lost all control. Carl swallowed hard, took a deep breath, trying to regain his usual professional composure, but his voice came out weaker than ever. But this isn't as simple as it looks. We need time to review." Big Shaq tilted his head, his gaze sharp as a laser cutting through Carl's every excuse, then slowly narrowed his eyes, his voice cold but filled with sarcasm. "But what? What now? Fix up, my guy." The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Carl Jensen felt a heavy pressure weighing down on his shoulders, not just from Big Shaq, but from everyone in the room. The customers standing around were no longer silent. They started nodding in agreement, their eyes waiting for a change. An older man took a step forward, his voice firm but unmistakably angry. "So what? You're not going to refund the money?" A young woman, still holding her small child, shook her head in disappointment. "I'm a single mom. I thought I miscalculated when I saw the money deducted. But was it really the bank doing this on purpose?" Another voice rang out from behind. "Exactly. I was also charged unfairly. How many people here have the same issue? What are you still reviewing?" Whispers spread quickly. Others began pulling out their phones to record, flashes lighting up in the cramped bank space. The cold, indifferent faces from before had transformed into eyes filled with anger. Brittany Wallace bit her lip, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though trying to hold on to something steady amidst the storm. But this storm couldn't be stopped. Carl Jensen now realized that if he didn't comply, everything would escalate in a way he couldn't control. It wasn't just about losing a few customers. It was about losing the entire reputation of the bank, about becoming the center of a financial scandal that would certainly spread far and wide. Big Shaq remained silent, observing like a judge waiting for the defendant to confess. Carl took a deep breath, his hand clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, and finally, after a long moment of tense silence, he reluctantly spoke, each word heavy with defeat. "Brittany, refund the money to everyone affected." Brittany's head snapped up, her eyes wide, not believing what she had just heard. "But, boss..." Carl turned to her, his gaze no longer sharp, no longer confident, only filled with despair. He knew he had no other choice. "Do it now." Brittany blinked a few times, then lowered her head and started entering commands into the system. Transactions appeared on the screen, the deducted amounts being refunded right in front of everyone. The room fell silent, but not the tense silence of before. It was the silence of satisfaction. A sense of victory was spreading through the room, not the victory of one person, but the victory of justice. Big Shaq, at last, smiled lightly. He crossed his arms, took a small step back, and nodded toward Linda Carter, the woman who had been there from the beginning. She had once felt small and humiliated, but now she was part of something meaningful. She looked up at the screen, where the numbers were changing, where her money was being refunded, and in that moment, for the first time all afternoon, she felt no longer looked down upon. Big Shaq turned his gaze back to Carl, who now looked as though he had lost everything, then softly but pointedly said, "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" No one said anything, but the eyes of everyone in the room agreed. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. The atmosphere in the bank is now completely different from when Linda Carter first stepped in. There are no longer indifferent looks, no more sarcastic chuckles, no more feelings of helplessness or embarrassment. Instead, there is a silence of anticipation, an invisible pressure weighing heavily on Carl Jensen's shoulders. The man, who was once accustomed to power, now finds himself in the weakest position he's ever been. The failure is etched deeply into his face. He is no longer the powerful branch manager, the one who could dismiss complaints with a half smile, no longer the one who could impose policies on customers he deemed less valuable. Now, Carl has no way out. He slowly inhales, his shoulders stiff as if trying to swallow down the lump of frustration in his throat. Under Big Shaq's cold, sharp gaze, with the eyes of all the customers and employees watching, Carl knows that if he doesn't do the right thing right now, things will only get worse. He can't avoid it, can't keep pretending, can't fool himself into thinking he's still in control. Finally, Carl Jensen reluctantly lowers his head, his voice dropping, dry yet still rising to speak. "I apologize for not treating Mrs. Carter properly." Linda stands still for a moment, her gaze fixed on Carl, no longer showing the confusion or hesitation she once had. The apology comes too late, but it is still an acknowledgement, a recognition that she was right, that she did not deserve to be treated like that she was not a small number to be easily dismissed. Big Shaq remains standing there, arms crossed, eyes never leaving Carl. But this time his face nods slightly, as if confirming that, at last, Carl has done what he should have done from the very beginning. Yes, that's a real apology. The customers in the bank nod slightly. Some even give a small applause, as if to confirm they've heard the apology, that they've witnessed this moment, that the truth has been made clear. But Big Shaq isn't done. He tilts his head, raising an eyebrow at Carl, his voice still steady but sharp. "But hey, an apology isn't just words, is it?" Carl Jensen stiffens, his jaw clenches slightly, because he knows exactly what Big Shaq is implying. An apology means nothing if you continue to let this happen again. Big Shaq says each word slowly, enough for everyone in the bank to fully understand the message he's conveying. Carl swallows hard, his eyes scanning the crowd, realizing that everyone is waiting for his response. Linda Carter, who had once been looked down upon, now stands tall, staring at Carl with a determined gaze. She doesn't need to say anything more because Big Shaq has spoken for her, has helped her regain the respect she truly deserves. Carl knows he has no other option. He inhales deeply, then slowly nods, this time without reluctance or hesitation. "I guarantee this will never happen again." Big Shaq continues to watch him, as if ensuring that those words aren't just empty promises. But after a few seconds he smiles lightly, claps his hands once, then looks around the room, his voice ringing with energy. "All right then, let this be a lesson. Speak up, stand your ground, and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't matter." His words echo throughout the room, and this time the room is no longer silent. The customers who had once been quiet now begin to clap. Those who had turned a blind eye now nod in agreement, because they know they've witnessed something more important than just a refund or an apology. They've witnessed a moment of justice. Carl Jensen can only stand there, head bowed, accepting the truth that he has lost. And Big Shaq, after ensuring that everything is resolved, finally relaxes his shoulders, adjusts his puffer jacket, and walks toward the bank door, leaving behind a change bigger than anyone could have imagined. The applause in the bank slowly faded, But the ripple effect of this event was just beginning. As soon as Big Shaq walked toward the door, the flash of phone cameras still flickered across the room. Customers, who had been quietly observing from beginning to end, were now actively recording the moment. A young man standing near the counter, who had raised his phone since the early moments of the confrontation, looked down at his screen, pressed a few buttons, and then smirked with amusement. He didn't need to say anything, but everyone could guess what was happening. The video had been uploaded to the internet, and, like a spark igniting dry hay, it exploded at a speed even Carl Jensen couldn't have imagined. Less than an hour later, on social media, the video titled "Big Shaq Exposes Bank's Scam" began appearing on major platforms. Netizens, always hungry for justice and dramatic turnarounds, quickly spread the video at lightning speed. The comments flooded in. My God, did they really scam elderly people? Big Shaq is a legend. Not only can he rap, but he also protects the vulnerable. This bank needs to be held accountable. I want to know how many other people they've done this to. Someone check if Carl Jensen still has his job. I bet he'll be fired within 24 hours. People began investigating the bank branch, digging up old complaints, posts from customers who had previously complained about mysteriously losing money, but no one had stood up for them until today. 3 hours later, the homepage of First Pacific Bank began to be bombarded with thousands of angry comments. Longtime customers who had once remained silent when their money was unfairly deducted now had enough proof to speak out. The bank's management, which initially downplayed the situation, started to feel the pressure as office phones rang nonstop. Complaint emails flooded in, and, most notably, the bank's stock showed signs of slight decline due to concerns from investors. Inside the branch office, Carl Jensen paced back and forth uncontrollably, his phone vibrating nonstop with dozens of messages and calls. He opened a new email from headquarters, his eyes glued to the text, "We have received numerous serious complaints regarding the way your branch has handled customer accounts. An internal investigation is underway. We request that you prepare to report directly to the board tomorrow morning." Carl gripped his phone tightly, veins bulging on his forehead, his palms drenched in sweat. He knew very well that once headquarters got involved, his career was over. The next morning, financial news outlets were flooded with headlines. First Pacific Bank embroiled in scandal over overcharging elderly customers. Big Shaq exposes the truth. Wilshire Boulevard branch under investigation. Bank promises to refund all affected customers. Carl Jensen, branch manager, immediately suspended. At the branch office, Carl Jensen entered a video meeting with the board of directors. But as soon as the screen lit up, a cold voice from headquarters spoke. "Mr. Jensen, thank you for attending. But this meeting is not for discussion. It is to inform you that your contract with the bank has officially been terminated." Carl opened his mouth to protest, but no one wanted to listen to him anymore. It was all over. In less than 24 hours, the once powerful figure at the top of the bank branch had been toppled. Elsewhere in the city, Linda Carter received a message from the bank. The wrongly deducted amount had been fully refunded. She sat by the window, looking out at the fading afternoon sky, turning a soft golden hue, with a gentle yet satisfied smile on her face. On the other side of the city, Big Shaq, in his iconic puffer jacket, adjusted his baseball cap, flashed a cool smile, and walked away, as if nothing had just happened. But everyone knew. What had occurred today would never be forgotten. Linda Carter sat by the window, holding a warm cup of tea in her hand, her eyes gazing outside at the afternoon sky, where the last rays of the day stretched across the quiet streets. Her story, originally just a visit to the bank to resolve a financial issue, had turned into an event no one could have predicted. The days had passed so quickly that even she hadn't fully processed everything yet. She had read the news, heard her neighbors talking about the incident that had gone viral, and received countless messages from people who had been in situations similar to hers. But what pleased her the most was the sense of respect and acknowledgement, something she thought she had lost in this fast-paced society. While she was lost in thought, the doorbell rang. A postal worker stood there, holding a brown envelope with a postmark from London. Linda was a bit surprised. She didn't know anyone in England. But when she took the package, her gaze stopped at a corner of the envelope, where a handwritten note in bold but personal handwriting read, "To Linda Carter, stay strong." Her heart skipped a beat. A strange yet warm feeling spread through her as she carefully opened the envelope, her old hands slowly peeling back the thick paper. Inside was a letter written in black ink on a slightly rough sheet of paper, as if the writer wanted to make sure it would endure over time. The strong words appeared before her eyes. "Dear Mrs. Carter, I know you don't need anyone to stand up for you, because you have enough strength to do that on your own from the start. I'm just here to remind you that you are not alone. You've taught countless generations, and today you continue teaching the world a lesson in fairness. Stay strong, my G. Keep doing your ting. Big Shaq." Linda couldn't help but laugh, a laugh both relieved and emotional. She could almost hear Big Shaq's tone when he wrote those lines, the way he always spoke with absolute certainty, without showing off, but never needing to prove anything. She turned the envelope over, and immediately her eyes widened in surprise. Inside, carefully folded, was a shiny black puffer jacket. Big Shaq's signature jacket with his unmistakable style. As she unfolded it, another detail emerged that deeply moved her. Right on the back of the jacket, there was a signature in silver ink, standing out against the black fabric. "To Linda, the real G. Big Shaq." Linda touched the signature, and a strange warmth filled her heart. She had always thought that things like this only happened in movies or in the inspiring stories people read about in the papers. But today, she realized that sometimes the impossible happens right in front of you, at the most unexpected moments. She put on the jacket, feeling the warm fabric hug her frail body. It was a bit loose, but strangely, it didn't make her feel small. On the contrary, it made her feel stronger than ever. Linda stood before the mirror, looking at her reflection. No longer the weak woman who had been dismissed at the bank that day. Now, she looked like someone who had regained her place in this world. With a gentle but confident smile, she zipped up the jacket and stepped out the door, ready to face whatever came next. Linda stood in front of the door, her shiny black puffer jacket enveloping her like an invisible armor. Not because it was thicker or warmer than the other coats she had worn, but because it symbolized something much greater. It was a symbol of a victory, not just a victory over an unjust banking system, but also a victory of courage, of determination, and of the belief that everyone deserves to be treated fairly. Today, she no longer felt small or overshadowed by numbers and dry regulations. She was no longer the trembling woman standing at the counter, desperately searching for an answer. Linda Carter had risen, had found her voice, and although she might have thought of herself as a solitary individual, the truth proved the opposite. She stepped down the porch, feeling the soft sunlight touch her face, a peaceful sensation she thought she had lost long ago. But this time, that peace did not come from resignation or giving up, but from confidence, a firm belief that she had the right to fight for what she deserved, that she didn't need to remain silent in the face of injustice, and, most importantly, that she was not alone. Her story was no longer just her story. It had become a reminder for many others out there, those who had been overlooked, ignored, or denied the rights they deserved. They would see themselves in this story, and they would remember that they too had a voice, and sometimes all they needed was a bit of courage to raise it. She walked down the familiar street, each step light but carrying a powerful energy that even she hadn't realized before. Neighbors smiled and greeted her. Some even waved and said they had watched the video about the incident at the bank, admiring how steadfast she had been. Linda just smiled, not a shy, modest smile, but one that was truly proud. And somewhere out there, Big Shaq, who had appeared at just the right moment, not as a hero, but as a reminder that justice still existed, that there would always be someone willing to stand up for what's right, was surely continuing his journey, continuing to do what he believed was right, just as he had done that day. Life isn't always fair, and sometimes it can make you feel small in the face of rigid rules and systems that seem unmovable. But Linda had learned one thing. No one has the right to take away your worth unless you let them. And with that lesson, this story closes with a simple yet powerful message. Don't let anyone look down on you. Always stand up for yourself, and sometimes the right person will appear to help you fight. NARP of the Minute.